What is poetry? Poetry is an art form that can explore a wide range of subjects, such as personal experiences to universal topics. The goal is to capture a particular feeling or thought in time. Ways to express this literary genre would be through aesthetic practices such as imagery, figurative language, and rhythm. Poems often use line breaks and stanzas for structure. They can also be structured with specific patterns or be freeform. What is so special about poetry is there is often deeper meanings and themes that are hidden in symbolic language, and it is up to the reader to find it.
Imagery. There are many tools at your disposal to craft a poem, but perhaps the most important is imagery. Imagery provides concrete sensory details that ground the reader in a tangible experience, making the emotions and themes more accessible and impactful. It helps the reader engage the meaning of a poem through their senses and can transmit emotions in a visceral manner when the image is fresh and detailed. We must be aware that an image in poetry isn't always visual. Imagery appeals to all our senses. It is anything you can describe that conjures sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. The opposite of an image is an abstraction, or a thought expressed without a concrete image. For instance, love, fear, hope, and despair. Because poets want to make the reader feel these emotions, simply stating them isn't enough to warrant a reaction. Furthermore, imagery that is strange and precise can elevate a poem and give it a sense of magic. It can help us see things in fresh and unexpected ways. Here is a chart of examples to help you better understand how an abstraction can be expressed using imagery. At the abstract level of the spectrum, we have home. Home is an abstraction because it is only the idea. Home can be very subjective depending on where you feel you belong. This idea is then attached to an image once you start visualizing what you meant by it. Home, for example, might be a house. You can visualize a house, though there is not much detail behind it. A close image is one that is rich in detail and makes you best visualize the description. Writing the red bungalow covered in Boston ivy paints a more detailed picture of that house. Another example comes from fear. We understand what fear is because we've felt it before, but the role of poetry is to make us visualize that emotion. Think of what you can describe that would represent fear. Often the emotion comes accompanied by a shiver. Describing this physical manifestation in detail would give us a closer image. The back of my neck speckled with goose flesh. Finally, one of the most used abstractions is love. We have all seen the symbol that best represents love, a heart. But if we would stay with this simple, familiar image, we wouldn't have the freshness that poetry calls for. Instead, consider a way to give detail and texture to that simple image. I lay my head upon my lover's chest and listened to the fast drumming of their heart.
Imagery examples. Here are some examples of imagery used by contemporary poets. Jericho Brown, Prayer of the Backhanded. Bless the back of my daddy's hand, which holding nothing tightly against me and not wrapped in leather, illuminated the air between itself and my cheek. Imagery is a great tool to help you look at things in a fresh, new way. Brown's use of precise detail describes a father slapping his son as corporal punishment, but does so in an unexpected way. It almost makes us visualize the air disappearing as a father strikes his son. We see something similar in Ocean Vuong's poem, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. The moon, distant and flickering, trapped itself in beads of sweat on my neck. I let the fog spill through the cracked window and cover my fangs. When I left, the Buick kept sitting there, a dumb bull in pasture its eyes searing my shadow onto the side of suburban houses. Here, however, the image looks at an object and describes it as something entirely different, making a familiar object strange. As such is known as defamiliarization, and it is a great way to bring freshness to the poem. In this instance, the Buick in Vong's verse transforms into a bull with eyes glowing, the light casting the speaker's shadow. Notice the word searing elevates the image, making it close and fresh. Sometimes the image itself, without the need to take something familiar and make it strange, is enough to add that layer of oddity that makes poetry rich. And after suicide, Matt Rasmussen writes, "My brother stood in the refrigerator light, drinking milk that poured out of his head through the thick black curls down his back into a puddle, growing larger around him." Here the image is enough to add a sense of surrealism, a dreamlike logic to the poem.
Figurative language. Poetry often uses figurative language to portray things through association. Some examples of figurative language are metaphor, simile, hyperbole, and synecdoche. These concepts might sound complicated at first, but we use these kinds of expressions all the time. Let us look at some examples of familiar phrases that use figurative language. A metaphor is an idea or object that is expressed through a different image. In this case, much like Ocean's example of a Buick being a bull, the metaphor is transformative. I'm sure most of you have heard of the phrase, "Eyes are the windows of the soul." A metaphor that transforms the object of eyes to windows to express an idea that looking at someone's eyes will tell you what kind of person they are. A simile, on the other hand, is comparative. It uses the word like or as to compare one image or idea to another, more complex image. The phrase, "it fits like a glove," is a simile because it uses comparison to express how something, usually a piece of clothing, fits perfectly. Hyperbole uses exaggeration to express the magnitude of an idea. And the expression, "I am dying of laughter," uses hyperbole to show us how funny something is. The speaker is not literally dying, but demonstrates emotion through exaggeration. Lastly, synecdoche uses a part of an object to represent its wholeness. For example, "That's a nice set of wheels." The speaker of this phrase is complimenting someone's car, representing it through its wheels. Remember that these are common expressions to help you better understand these literary devices. Poetry should strive for freshness, always, and using familiar phrases in a poem would defeat that purpose.
Simile and metaphor. Two of the most prominent examples of figurative language are similes and metaphors. Let's take a closer look at how they are constructed. The components that make these elements of craft are the tenor and the vehicle. The tenor refers to the idea or object being described through comparison, simile, or transformation, metaphor. The vehicle is the image or phrase used to describe it. To better understand this, let's look at some examples. In Feared Drown, Sharon Olds writes, "Your suit black as seaweed, your bearded head slick as a seal's, and later, I walked down the edge of the water, clutching the towel like a widow's shawl around me." We know these are similes because of the use of like and as. The first instance of tenor here is the suit, and more specifically, the color of the suit. The vehicle that compares the suit's color is seaweed. A towel is another tenor we find later in the poem, and the vehicle used to compare it is a widow's shawl. Notice how the words Olds chooses are all images related to the greater subject at hand, the possibility that the loved one has drowned. She crafts images of sea, a seal, and of death, a widow's shawl to frame the mood of the poem. The tenor and the vehicle might be a bit harder to discern in some metaphors. In Susan Wood's If Grief Were a Bird, the word were helps us to connect the tenor, which is grief, to its vehicle, a bird. But many times, a metaphor won't have a word connecting these two elements. In Wood's poem, the old, half-remembered sadness is described as a bird by describing its actions. It hovers over the speaker, flapping its wings. Here, the tenor is the sadness, and the vehicle the actions of flapping wings.
Rhythm. Rhythm in poetry is the pattern of sounds and beats created around the structure of the poem. For example, stressed and unstressed syllables. Rhythm can be a fundamental aspect of poetry that gives it a musical feel. Here is one of many traditional elements of rhythm in poetry. Meter. Meter is defined by the type and number of feet in each line. Each foot is a specific combination of stressed and unstressed syllables. For example, iambic follows an unstressed, stressed syllable pattern, like believe. Other metrical feet include trochaic, spondaic, anapestic, and dactylic.
Iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is a type of metrical line used in traditional English poetry and verse drama. Syllable pattern. Each line contains 10 syllables grouped into 5 iambs. To write in iambic pentameter, the prosody of each poetic line is ta-dum, 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 ta-dum. Rhythm. The pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables creates a rising and falling rhythm. I went to see the doctor yesterday.
As an example, we have Ada Limon's Instructions on Not Giving Up. More than the fuchsia funnels breaking out of the crab apple tree. More than the neighbor's almost obscene display of cherry limbs shoving their cotton candy colored blossoms to the slate sky of spring rains. It's the greening of the trees that really gets to me, when all the shock of white. A closer look at an iambic pentameter. The first 4 lines are in iambic pentameter before a change in the 5th line. More than the fuchsia funnels breaking out, and so on and so forth.
Other types of rhythms. Repetition. Repetition of sounds, words, phrases, and structures that reinforce rhythm and make a poem more memorable. This can include alliteration, assonance, consonants, and refrains. Alliteration is the repeating sound is placed at the beginning of the word. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds in words that are close together. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Consonance is when words share the same consonant sound, but they come after different vowel sounds. He struck a streak of bad luck. Refrains, a line, phrase, or single word that is repeated periodically within the poem. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Overall, varying the rhythm in a poem allows the poet to manipulate the reader's experience, conveying emotions, guiding interpretation, and enhancing the overall impact and artistry of the work.
Rhyme. In poetry, rhyme refers to the repetition of similar sounding words, typically at the end of lines. Example: I was in a dark room, loud tunes, looking to make a bow soon. Kendrick Lamar, Swimming Pools, Drank. Slant rhymes are when words that have similar sounds but not identical. Example: I'm dumb enough to walk in a store and steal, so I'm dumb enough to ask for a date with Lauryn Hill. Here Eminem rhymes steal with heel in his song Role Model. Internal rhyme occurs in the middle of poetry lines instead of at the end of lines. Example, young and gifted, my tongue's prolific. Hip-hop artist AC as shown in the format. I rhyme. When two words are spelled similarly and look like they would be pronounced the same but aren't. Example, thought and thuff.
Structure and form. The structure and form of a poem are based on the decisions the poet makes regarding how the poem will be arranged and look on the page. For example, how many stanzas should make up the poem? Where will the line be broken? Will a mechanic or fixed form work better to deliver the poem's intention, or will free verse work better? A stanza is a group of lines that make a part of a poem. The word comes from the Italian word for room. This is a great way to think of your poem, a set of rooms the reader moves through. A line is a single row of text in a poem. It is important to know that a line is always different from a sentence, meaning that you might not want to make all your lines sentences. This will rob you of potential ways to add meaning and rhythm to your poem. A line ending in any punctuation mark is known as an end stop, while a line that is broken in the middle of a sentence where there is no punctuation is called an enjambment. Enjambment can help you emphasize certain words, create a sense of hesitation, and enhance the rhythm of the line. Structure and form should always be mindful of how these decisions are used to portray the poem's intended meaning and emotion. A sonnet, for example, is typically associated with themes of love, so it makes sense that the traditional Shakespearean sonnet ends in a rhyming couplet or two lines.
Anatomy of a poem. Let's now look at this poem by Andrea Cohen to see what these concepts look like. Brutal. Brutal to give the prisoner a window, a blue sky glimpse, as if an afterlife existed. Brutal for you to parade in a body in the same room where I dream you. Brutal to give, and each row of text after it is a line. The group of lines separated by a space is a stanza. For example, as if an afterlife existed. Brutal, for you to parade, is the second stanza in Cohen's poem. This stanza ends with an enjambment because there is no punctuation at the end of the line. The last line of the poem ends with an end stop because it ends with a punctuation mark. Every line that ends with any kind of punctuation is an end stop, so even the lines you see here ending with an M dash are end stopped. One of the most important parts of the poem is the page's white space. White space is a part of the page with no text. It is as important as the text because it creates tension by fighting the text. It represents silence and therefore holds what is left unsaid from the poem, the ideas that are left for the reader to interpret, or the implications that the speaker refuses to acknowledge in language.
Organic versus mechanic form. Mechanic form follows traditional structures and patterns. These forms have specific rules regarding rhyme, meter, line length, and stanza arrangement, like the ones we previously described. Organic poetry does not need to have a set rhyme scheme. It can break all the rules. This type of poetry is called free verse. Organic poetry can have a structure that does not seem logical or regular. Rather than following pre-existing patterns and conventional structures, the poet can add more personal expression and feelings. There is also creative freedom to break away from traditional poetry and experiment with structures to create something entirely new.
As an example of this, we have Leila Chatty's creation myth. There was a hole, I filled it. Like a fist in a maw, like blood in a wound. I swelled unbidden as a storm. I ripened, a clot on a stem, a mulberry, stewed in my mother's fine claret, rocked by the moon's sharp pull. I was given darkness to soothe me, named for it. When at last the ache came, it brought me. In this poem, there is no logical structure, rhyme, or pattern.
No matter what style you choose to write, poetry is an art form that can explore a wide range of subjects. Ways to express this literary genre would be through aesthetic practices such as imagery, figurative language, rhythm, line breaks, stanzas.
As you begin your journey of writing a poem, here are some quick tips to help you get started. Free write. Spend 10 minutes free writing without worrying about form or grammar. It's also called a stream of consciousness. The idea is to see if any ideas or lines can be developed into a poem. Writing prompts. Find prompts you can use that help get your creativity flowing and spark ideas. Read poetry. Expose yourself to different kinds of styles and forms and see which poets inspire you.
Online assistance is available via the epcc Writing Center website. You can meet one-on-one with a tutor virtually on Blackboard Collaborate. Audible and written feedback is also available via email submission. Please visit the Writing Center website for more information and operating hours.